Deadpool 2 is a solid film that respects the development of its returning characters, introduces some solid new characters, and crafts a plot that perfectly weaves together action, comedy, and drama in a way very similar to its 2016 predecessor. All in all, it was a good film that did a lot of things right, but it's not quite as strong as the original. This review is now going to cover my in-depth analysis of the film in 4 parts. Part 1 will look at the character development, Part 2 will cover humor, Part 3 will analyze the action in the film, and Part 4 will examine the overall plot. In Part 5 then I will take a brief look at the architects of this film, as well as how it performed critically and financially. And then I will conclude the review with my final thoughts and the justification for my rating of the film in Part 6. Each aspect of the film in Parts 1 through 4 will then be rated on a scale from 1 to 10, and here is a brief breakdown of the verbal representation of that scale. Now, with all that said,
give me your best shot, One-Eyed Willie.
Part 1. Characters. I'm going to analyze the 3 main characters in depth first, namely Deadpool, Cable, and Russell, and I will do so using 3 primary criteria. The first is motivation, which will be assessed using 2 questions. 1. How did the character get this way? And 2. Why are they doing what they're doing? The second criteria is the actions the characters take to address their motivation. Finally, I will analyze their characterization as defined by the speech, actions, and overall presence of the actor bringing the character to life. So first up is Deadpool. So first we have to address where Deadpool is at the start of the film. Basically our hero is trying to blow himself up, and the question is why. So shortly after this scene, we learn that in the time between the first film and now, Deadpool has taken on the ugly task of wiping out the worst of the worst in the criminal underworld, doing the jobs that nice superheroes won't. Unfortunately, the one mobster Deadpool fails to finish off tracks him down and, in his attempt to kill Wade, ends up killing Vanessa. Now, I argued in my review of the first Deadpool film that Vanessa in many ways served as Wade's heart, the key component to unlocking his vulnerable side, and killing her essentially hit him in the one part of himself that doesn't heal. So, Wade is an emotional wreck through most of the first 2 acts of this film because he has not only lost his emotional anchor, but he also blames himself for her death. So now we know how Deadpool got the way he is in this film. The question is, why is he doing what he's doing? This can be divided into 2 parts. What he's doing through the first 2 acts, and what he's doing in the final act. Through the first 2/3 of the film, he is more or less endeavoring to accomplish the impossible task of killing himself because he feels responsible for Vanessa's death and he wants to go off to the afterlife to be with her. From the second half of Act 2, Wade shifts his focus toward trying to save Russell from Cable's murderous rage. The question is, why does his motivation shift? There are a few key components for answering this that link back to a conversation Wade has with Vanessa at the beginning of the film. First, prior to her death, Vanessa informed Wade that she removed her IUD, which leads to this priceless exchange.
My IUD.
A bomb?
So the pair is set on the path toward parenthood. During a subsequent conversation, Wade indicates that he's concerned about being a father because his own dad abandoned him and he'd never really had any positive male guidance. Vanessa tries to reassure him that he is not going to abandon their child like Wade's father abandoned him, and she drops a key line that is repeated later in the film about kids giving people a chance to be better than they used to be. If we take these moments and connect them with the first message Wade receives from Vanessa in the way station between life and death that informs him that his heart is not in the right place, Wade realizes that protecting Russell is important to getting his heart in the right place. The underlying through line here is that Russell represents a kind of trial run at fatherhood for Wade, and his initial abandonment of Russell led him directly to the kind of father he did not want to become, namely his own father who abandoned him. The additional layer here is that Wade starts to see his own experiences in Russell and how abandonment can lead to a lack of trust in others and the tendency to push people away or avoid meaningful connections for fear of getting hurt. Wade saw family as a bad thing because he had only had bad experiences until Vanessa came into his life. Russell was leaning in that direction, and Wade finally realized he needed to step in and stop that from happening. Furthermore, Wade's defense of Russell also helps connect both the idea of fatherhood from Wade and Vanessa's story to the overarching theme of family. Okay, so what does Wade do to address his motivation? Well, regarding his initial motivation to join Vanessa in the afterlife, he tries everything up to lying down on several barrels of gasoline and blowing up his entire apartment with him in it to end his life. Then he gets himself sent to the icebox where a collar is strapped to his neck that negates his powers, thus allowing the cancer to run rampant through his body. All in all, he does nearly everything he could possibly do to die, though this proved fruitless as dying is the one thing he's not capable of doing. Regarding his later motivation of protecting Russell, he engages Cable in the prison and does everything he can to keep him from hurting Russell, puts together the X-Force to try to defend Russell on the prison transport, makes a deal with Cable to team up and stop Russell from killing the headmaster, and eventually throws himself in the path of a bullet with one of the icebox collars on to show Russell how far he was willing to go to save him. In other words, his every action is in service of addressing his motivation, and while some parts are played for comedic effect, each step he takes makes logical sense to address said motivations. Finally, characterization. Ryan brings the same amount of passion to the character as in the first film. Again, what makes this character work so well though is the contrast between the Deadpool persona and the Wade Wilson persona. When Ryan is in the suit, the sarcasm and the violence are turned up to full volume. But as soon as the mask comes off, there is more of a sense of vulnerability and humanity. Yes, he's still an obnoxious ass, but there is more to him, and this comes through more often when Wade appears from behind the mask. For example, the scene with Colossus that reasserts the theme of the whole film.
I killed every last one of them, except me. Couldn't kill me. We were gonna start a family. You know, we were gonna be a family.
Another is in the hurt and vulnerability you can see in his face just before he kills the gangster that killed Vanessa. Then there's the look in his eyes when he's about to finally cross over and be with Vanessa, as well as when he apologizes to her. And then again when he has to say goodbye to her for the second time. The point is, Deadpool and Wade combine to create a multi-layered character that allows him to be effective dramatically, romantically, comedically, and as an action hero, and Ryan pulls this off really well in this film. So for motivation, actions, and characterization, Deadpool gets 9s all around in this film. Next up is Cable. Cable's motivation is quite possibly one of the clearest and easiest to delineate because the answer to how he got the way he is and why he's doing what he's doing is answered with the same 4 words. Russell killed his family. This is by no means intended to insinuate that his motivation is simplistic or shallow. Quite to the contrary, I think the straightforward nature of his motivation makes his character feel more relatable. Furthermore, the nature of his motivation relates to a basic characteristic of human psychology, namely the desire for revenge, particularly when loved ones are involved, which makes his quest easily relatable. In that way, it's fitting that they got the director of the first John Wick movie to direct this film, as John Wick's entire motivation could be summed up in a similar manner to Cable's. How did John Wick get the way he is, and why is he doing what he's doing? They killed his dog. Well, and stole his car. So no one stole Cable's car, but you get the point. The idea of avenging loved ones is something that resonates with people, and revenge as a motivation is potentially one of the easiest motivations to sell. The main necessary ingredient to make it work is an actor that can sell the mixture of fury, determination, and pain that generally goes along with it, and Josh Brolin has that in this film. So what does Cable do to address his motivation? He travels back to the time just before Russell kills for the first time and tries to kill him. To give a brief backstory on Cable, he is a soldier of sorts from the future that has the unpleasant job of dealing with rogue mutants, which is what Russell eventually becomes in Cable's version of the future. Cable tried to take Russell out a few times in the future without success, which pissed Russell off, so Russell showed up at Cable's house and killed Cable's wife and daughter. Now, I will say this once to get it out of the way. Time travel in general is a shit mechanic because it inevitably raises the question of why didn't you deal with this by doing X? For example, could Cable have just gone back to right before his family died and tried to kill Russell when he walked in the house? Could he have gone back to when Russell was a baby and killed him then? Or as Deadpool puts it, why not go back and kill baby Hitler? Now, Cable states he has 2 charges in his time travel device and that the further he travels in time from his origin point, the harder it is to control. So Cable had 1 charge to get him to that moment and 1 to get him home, and it seems that the time they were in was about as far back as he could go and still control it. Eventually in the post-credit scenes we get around the 2 charge thing, but the film is trying to use a one-off line to lock this down. In general though, I would argue the time travel in this film works better than in many other time travel films for 2 reasons. 1, they don't try to over-explain it a la Endgame only to have it fall on its face, and 2, they keep the idea simple. As a bonus as well, I'll give them some credit for Deadpool breaking the 4th wall to at least address this with this line.
Well, that's just lazy writing.
To summarize though, there will almost always be questions and potential issues when time travel gets involved, and this film is no different. I will concede that this might bother some people, and I would agree that the time travel aspect could objectively cause plot problems. I never really felt that way with this film though, so I would need to hear a convincing argument to the contrary. Getting back to Cable, the moment Cable returns to is symbolic for the film though because it is the genesis point of Russell's trek down the dark path, making him more manageable as a foe. But we do have to acknowledge that Cable was still down for killing a kid. Nevertheless, time travel what-if questions aside, Cable's actions once he arrives makes perfect sense. He's there to kill Russell and he does everything he can to accomplish that. Were it not for Deadpool getting in the way, he would have achieved it in the prison or on the transport truck. Once the truck fails and the Juggernaut is released, Cable realizes he is not capable of handling Russell on his own now, and seeing as how it's Deadpool's fault that the Juggernaut got released, he decides DP should help him put the Jack back in the box, as it were. At that point, it's also clear that while Cable saw killing Russell as the means of solving his problem, there was at least some level of hesitation. Going to Deadpool foreshadowed the completion of his arc, where he decides to use his last time travel jump to go back and save Deadpool. So why does he do that? Because even though Cable was driven initially by his need for vengeance, that need was based on the deeper goal of accomplishing the job he failed to do initially, protecting his family. To use John Wick again, John is an instrument of death that was used by bad people to kill other bad people. Cable seems to have been an instrument of death that only did bad things in the hopes of staving off worse things. Thus, in his grief, killing Russell seemed to be the only solution to his problem. Deadpool's sacrifice proved that not to be true. Once a path opened up where Cable was able to protect his family and not have to kill Russell, he was willing to sacrifice returning to his family in order to do what he knew was the right thing. This is why I appreciated this character so much. He was an antagonist in that he was out to kill Russell, but there was more to the character than that. He had a family that he loved, and once he knew they were saved, he proved there was more to him than just the need for vengeance. Finally, characterization. Cable as an antagonist was by far the greatest upgrade from the first film. As enjoyable as Francis/Ajax was in the first film, he was a bit one-dimensional. Cable, on the other hand, is far more dynamic as a character and actually goes through a realistic arc. He was a soldier tasked with trying to fix a broken world who had the most precious thing taken from him, his family, which again is a running theme in the film. There is also a clear symmetry between Wade and Cable, which Cable highlights with this line.
It was my fault she died. It was my job to stop people like him. He came into my home and took the only thing that made it a home. Sound familiar?
I'm sorry.
Josh Brolin does a great job of providing a multi-layered character that is a soldier bent on revenge, but also a grieving husband and a father that can grudgingly appreciate what Deadpool is trying to do for Russell. One of the better moments in the film for Cable's character is where he decides to use his last time charge to save Deadpool instead of returning to his family. I also love that he started subtly quipping along with Deadpool, which I felt showed that he was starting to soften toward Wade. Cable was a great character that worked well as an intimidating antagonist in the second act, then a grudging teammate in the third act. Brolin's characterization also brought another new comedic angle in Cable's aggressive and kind of gruff old man delivery, as well as an emotionally scarred but ultimately honorable man. Like Deadpool, Cable also gets 9s all around for motivation, actions, and characterization. Finally, we have Russell. Oh boy, here we go. In terms of motivation, this character fits the film well. He's an emotionally traumatized teenager who is desperately searching for an ally who cares about his well-being. So how did he get this way? He was physically, psychologically, and emotionally abused in a boarding school for mutants run by a man who believed that mutants are an abomination. Why is he doing what he's doing? For all the aforementioned abuses, Russell wants to treat his former torturer to some well-deserved torture of their own. In other words, he wants revenge. Thus, while the driving force behind their motivation for revenge might have differed, both Russell and Cable were motivated by the same core desire: to destroy the person that caused them a level of emotional pain they could not let go of. Russell wanted to kill the headmaster for all the emotional damage that man had inflicted upon him, and Cable wanted to kill Russell for the same reason, with the added facet that in killing Russell, Cable might be able to save his family as well. Long story short, Russell is also driven by revenge, which the film does a great job of setting up. The targets of Russell's rage have a limited screen time, but the film does everything it needs to make the audience hate them and fully sympathize with Russell's desire to kill them. So how does Russell go about addressing his motivation? At the start of the film, the X-Men, or as the film might say, the X-Men this film can afford, are called out to try and subdue Russell because he's using his powers to try and attack the people who run the boarding school. After Deadpool knocks him out and they are both sent off to the icebox together, Russell tries to befriend Wade in the hopes of them breaking out of the prison and then eventually getting his revenge on the headmaster. This leads Wade to passing on some, well, sensible advice that he is seriously going to regret.
Stop trying to shake the biggest guys in here and make friends with them.
Unfortunately for Wade, Russell finds the Juggernaut. Once Russell hooks up with the Juggernaut, he leads him back to the boarding house to extract his revenge. So, each action Russell took was trying to get him right back to where he started, at the boarding school trying to burn the place down with the headmaster in it. Therefore, Russell had a clearly established motivation in this film that was easy to sympathize with, and the actions he took to address it were logical. Sadly, Russell's characterization is where this all falls apart. All due deference to Julian Dennison, but his characterization of Russell was by far the worst part of the film. As good as his core motivation was, the character just didn't work because either the acting or the direction for the actor was just bad. None of his jokes landed, his emotional scenes aren't believable, and the CG action scenes with him were unintentionally funny. So I was laughing at him when I wasn't supposed to be, and cringing at him when he was trying to be funny. Furthermore, the choice of actor did not feel organic, and the moment Russell threw out the line, "When was the last time you saw a plus-size superhero?" I was shaking my head. That's why he's here. Not because he was the best choice for the character, but so that we could play lines like that. All in all, the primary word that sums up his characterization in this film is obnoxious. So sadly, this portion gets a 1. So Russell gets 9s for motivation and actions, but a 1 for characterization. Wrapping up the character section, I want to talk briefly about the supporting cast. The supporting cast for this film was good, once again, but it did suffer from the sequel problem of adding so many new characters that the screen time for each kind of takes a hit. Vanessa was the first character that was reduced, but I feel like this one made the most sense for what they were trying to do with the narrative overall. Now, I've heard some people argue that Vanessa got fridged, but I disagree. Real quick, for those unfamiliar with the trope, according to the website Scribophile, fridging is a literary trope in which a character exists for the sole purpose of being killed, assaulted, or otherwise harmed in order to serve as an inciting incident that motivates another character's journey. Vanessa's death actually sends Wade into a suicidal death spiral. I guess it depends on how you characterize their interactions in the spirit world, but she exists in the narrative for much the same reason she did in the first film, as the only person capable of unlocking the deeper emotional parts of Wade and to bring out the best in him. Her death breaks him, and one could argue that his journey doesn't really start until Vanessa gives him the line about his heart not being in the right place. It might still be argued that all of this connects to her dying, but I find it reductive to claim that she only existed for the sole purpose of being killed so that Wade could go on a journey. Vanessa balances Wade out, and he needed her throughout the film to learn how to become the man he needed to be. In essence, his journey throughout the film teaches him the lesson he and Vanessa were having a conversation about at the outset regarding the kind of father he was afraid of becoming. By the end, he knows what kind of father he wants to be and can be, and as soon as he gets the time device fixed, he goes and unfridges her, if that's how you want to read it. For me, that was the closing of that loop, going right back to the point where he was uncertain of becoming a father to a man who can state without hesitation that he's naming his child Cher. Okay, sorry, that made no sense, I know, but the point is, he's confident now, and it's because of her influence throughout the film. Finally, once again, Morena Baccarin was amazing. She truly is adept at conveying a wide range of believable emotions. The connection between Wade and Vanessa feels truly organic, and the chemistry between the two actors is present in all of their scenes together. Then there was Colossus. I feel like I haven't heard enough people talking about how much Colossus actually brought to these first two films. He truly was a well-written character who plays such a crucial counterpoint to Wade's outlook. The beauty of the second film is that instead of just leaving them where they were, they subtly brought each character a step or two toward each other's viewpoint. Wade gave a little and came to see Colossus's side a bit, and Colossus gave a little and learned how to curse. It was a nice way of keeping the characters consistent with who they were while allowing them to grow and change a little. I want to emphasize the little bit, because this point works so well in contrast to the films that will suddenly have a character pull a full 180 and turn into something diametrically opposed to who they were even moments before. That can only lead to motivational and directional whiplash. Thankfully, that is not what this film does. Colossus is still the Boy Scout, but he can see how playing dirty might be the right answer in some situations. Likewise, Deadpool came to see that killing people willy-nilly can lead people down the wrong path sometimes as well. That doesn't mean Wade won't still do that more often than not, or that Colossus isn't going to tend toward the goody two-shoes route most of the time, but rather that the two saw the validity in each other's viewpoint and found a way to meet in the middle. That, I would argue, is a well-written development. Additionally, I also truly appreciate that there's a subtle but poignant connection between Colossus's motivation and Wade's, and that Wade is the lost cause that Colossus refuses to give up on, and Russell becomes the lost cause that Wade refuses to give up on. In the film's own weird way, Colossus became the father figure Wade always needed. Next up is Dopinder. This is another area where this film excelled, and it truly is sad how the third Deadpool movie lost their ability to do this. Dopinder was really funny in his limited screen time in the first film, building up a story of a love-struck man with slight homicidal tendencies. This film then builds on that by having him want to become a hero like his buddy Deadpool. The film plays with the odd balance of his unassuming and goofy nature with his sudden outbursts of rage, not to mention his weird obsession with Kirsten Dunst in Interview with the Vampire, to send him on a little arc where he gets to run over Russell's headmaster with his taxi at the end. The point being, the film managed to take Dopinder on an arc with just a few scenes and a scant amount of dialogue. Compare that with the mixed bag of dumb fuckery that was the cameo splooge in Deadpool 3, and I can't see how people can't see it. What characters in Deadpool 3 progressed from their plot lines in Deadpool 2? I'll spoil it for you. None. Zero. They threw them all away, and I shall never forgive them for that.
All right, that's it. Dishonor. Dishonor on your whole family. Make a note of this. Dishonor on you. Dishonor on your cow.
But I digress. Dopinder was awesome, and I loved him. Blind Owl and Weasel then added in a few good lines in the film as well, but I feel like these two took the biggest hit in terms of reduced screen time, which ultimately damaged the humor in the film. Why? Well, in the calculus of runtime, every second that Russell was telling jokes that didn't land could have been passed back to either of these two characters, and our hit ratio could only have gotten better. Next up from the old cast was Negasonic, who wasn't a huge part of the first film, so I almost feel like she got nearly an equivalent amount of screen time in this film. Her relationship with Wade was carried over really well, and their few moments of antagonizing each other like siblings was still fun. The added bit for Negasonic was that she got a girlfriend. This part, I feel like I can't be impartial about. I absolutely love Yukio, but I feel like I might be biased. I've spent the better part of the last 15 years living and working in Japan, and I cannot tell you how many students I have met with exactly that level of goofy-ass energy. And it just made me smile every time she got that ultra-happy look on her face and said, "Hi, Wade." It might just be me, but I found the character really charming in a hyper-goofy way that resonates with my experience teaching Japanese university students, so I really liked Yukio. She was another great instance of counterbalancing as well with Negasonic's emo grumpy character. Finally, there's X-Force. I'll leave Domino for last since she is the only one that survives long enough to really talk about character development wise, but the rest of X-Force was effective for what that part of the film was trying to accomplish. Each of the characters added a slightly different flavor of comedy to the bit, and overall it was fun watching each of them die in those somewhat Saw-like manners. They were meant to be a bit over the top and ridiculous, and it worked. Domino then also brought a really fun element to the film. The back and forth about whether or not luck was a superpower was great, and the scene that establishes how her power works was also entertaining both comedically and visually, with the best part being Deadpool arguing that her power just did not seem very cinematic while it's literally playing out, cinematically. Zazie Beetz also brought a lot of charisma to the character, and her comedic timing was good. She showed up toward the end of Act 2 and did not have a lot of lines to work with, but her character was immediately likable from her introduction, and they did a nice job of tying her into the narrative at the end as well. All in all, I was really impressed with her as an addition to the film. Taken together, I give the supporting cast an 8 overall. That brings us to the end of part 1, so let's take a look at the scores for this section. Deadpool got a 9, Cable got a 9, Russell got a 6, the supporting cast got an 8, and that gives the character section of this review an 8 overall. Now we'll move on to part 2, humor.
And like a lot of dicks, he's as hard as a rock and causes nothing but problems!
The humor in the second Deadpool film was good. However, it was a slight downgrade from the first film. There are two primary reasons for this. First, nearly every joke that Russell attempted didn't land, and given he was a key part of the plot in this film, he took up a rather large part of the screen time. So you have the character trailing only Deadpool and Cable in terms of screen time, dropping turds all over the film, and as evidence, we'll run through his greatest hits.
Prison wallet, if you know what I'm saying.
Prison wallet?
You're about to get dick slapped.
What is that? That's not a real rope!
Damn, it feels good to be a gangster. Go home, Wade! I have an idea.
Oh, no, let's not.
The second problem wasn't necessarily the film's fault per se, but more an issue almost inherent in creating sequels, which is that it needed to do the same thing, but different. In other words, they have to keep what worked from the first film, but ramp it up and alter it so it doesn't feel like it's just doing the same gags over again. Long story short, the humor in this film is a slight downgrade because it did at times feel like they were doing some gags over again. This is honestly a minor criticism though, and it's really hard to avoid. To go to bat for it in rebuttal, I would argue that the same thing is true about Austin Powers 2 or Naked Gun 2.5, both films that I absolutely love. They are hilarious, but not quite as funny as the original. The same applies here. The film is really funny where it hits, but it's not quite as funny as the first film. On the positive side, one of the strengths of this film, and its predecessor in terms of humor, was that the films did an excellent job of giving each character a unique comedic voice that allowed for a greater combination of humorous moments. I think of it like using color theory. Combining the right combination of contrast can make the overall palette more appealing. Conversely, if you stick to one single color for everything, you end up with something monochrome, and while there is an audience for that, I personally find it a bit bland. This, I would argue, is one of the problems with Deadpool and Wolverine. All of the comedic jokes sounded just like Deadpool, making it a monochrome mess of the same jokes over and over again. Deadpool 1 and 2, on the other hand, gave each character their own unique flavor of comedy that fit with the character's voice. So for example, Deadpool sets the overall tone by being hyper-sarcastic, and his jokes usually involve elements of a sexual or violent nature. Let's take a look at a few of his best jokes from Deadpool 2.
Pelvis to pelvis. Let's go tip to tip. There we go. The kids call this docking. Even if I have to teabag him to death.
But it's really just a sip of tea at this point.
Zip it, Black Widow. Black Tom Cuss.
White Wade Wilson.
You killed Black Tom, you racist son of a bitch! I just want someone to find a planet of people that are worse than me at everything. A whole bunch of functional idiots. I'm gonna go there and I'm gonna be their Superman.
Isn't that Canada?
You shut your goddamn trash mouth.
You stay here with your weird secret sex lips. All these elderly white men on the walls. Should have brought my rape whistle.
Scoutmaster Kevin?
You trusted me. I took that trust and turned it into a glory hole in an airport bathroom.
He's unstoppable.
He has an ass pen. He'll stab you with it.
Weasel then is the closest to Deadpool's tone and delivery, but the unique flavor is that he tends to be a bit spineless and less violent.
He beat me within an inch of my life. He was torturing me. But all I told him was everything he wanted to know.
Go.
It's like he was giving birth anally, but they quit halfway through. They got the legs out and they said, you know what? I'm done. All right, I'll put out a call for resumes, but we're not paying medical or dental. It's time to get back on LinkedIn. It's a goddamn fanny pack, and you know it, you sick son of...
Then you have Colossus, whose humorous contribution is that he is the Boy Scout, straight arrow character that isn't really trying to be funny, but he ends up that way because his pure nature creates such a staunch contrast to the raunchiness of the rest of the cast. This film then added in a new flavor with Cable, the grumpy old man who always seems angry even when he's telling jokes.
Dubstep's on pussies.
You're so dark.
You sure you're not from the DC universe?
Great.
X-Force.
I guess dubstep never dies. Because of you, I'll always know what a grown man with baby balls looks like.
You can't stop me!
Even runs like a fucking pervert.
The cherry on top with Cable as well is that it's his interactions with Wade that seem to slowly drag him into making jokes. It always felt like to me that he was gradually coming to understand that sarcasm was the language Deadpool understood, so he needed to use the jokes to get him to listen. So he was almost doing it begrudgingly at first just to get Deadpool to listen, and then over time he actually started to enjoy it himself as he came to sympathize more with Wade. The final example I'll use is Dopinder, who is a pure spirit that loves his Kirsten Dunst, but also erupts in sudden bursts of homicidal rage at certain moments.
Back up.
I will bathe in the blood of your enemies. Like 10-year-old Kirsten Dunst, motherfucker. My body is an instrument of death.
Not now, Dopinder.
I've had 3 tickets already. No, DP, not again.
You're in.
Yeah.
Oh, I shit my pants.
Overall, the humor in this film was good, with the majority of the cast adding a unique comedic voice to the movie that was effective and created a nice variety of funny moments. However, Russell's attempts at humor failed in nearly every instance, and he took up too much screen time and tried to tell too many jokes. Finally, the film does suffer a bit when comparing it to the first film, which was tighter and hit a bit harder because the gags were fresh. Thus, the humor in Deadpool 2 gets an 8. Next, we'll move on to part 3, action.
You got 30 seconds, you jabbering butt plug.
Now we're getting it.
There were 4 primary action sequences in this film. The opening montage of murdering gangsters, the fight in the prison against Cable, the second fight on the truck against Cable, and finally the showdown with the Juggernaut at the boarding school. Overall, the action in this film was great, and each of the fights served a clear narrative purpose that made sense for the overall plot. Additionally, the variation in tonal balance between intense action and comedy was handled well, much like the first Deadpool film. The opening gangster montage had some fun choreography, but much like the montage in the first film where Deadpool was killing the underlings to find Francis, the tone of the opening montage was skewed a bit more toward comedy. Narratively, this opening montage also served to illustrate what Wade had been up to in the time between the end of the first Deadpool film and the opening of this film. Finally, for this bit, it also served as the catalyst for what gets Vanessa killed. So we open up with some nice action shots combined with some good comedic beats to get the movie started off on a strong note. The second fight shifts the tone toward a more serious note when Cable showed up at the icebox to kill Russell. Cable had some really cool looking maneuvers with his gun, and the moment Wade gets his hand on the weapon is priceless. We are also introduced to Cable's shield and many of the different futuristic armaments he is equipped with, so the scene has a nice balance of tension, interesting choreography, and cool weaponry. The scene also served to shift the conflict in the film from Deadpool's desire to die toward needing to protect Russell, and it introduces Cable, who serves as the antagonist for the second act of the film. The third fight introduces X-Force, and we get the joy of watching everyone but Domino die some pretty gruesome deaths before Domino and DP take on Cable on a moving truck. This scene had perhaps the one action sequence from this film that really stuck with me, which was the moment when Deadpool tried to do his bullet-cutting bit by whirling his swords, and it's both fun to watch and hilarious seeing the little spurts of blood coming out of the back of him as he fails to cut through many of Cable's bullets. Then we get the nice bit at the end.
Ow!
This scene, much like the fight in the prison, was mostly tilted toward tense action with some humor thrown in, and both elements again worked well. This was also probably Domino's strongest scene overall, because we get to see firsthand how her power works, and she was able to get a few hits in against Cable when she shoots the gas canister that forces Cable to drop his, I guess those circular things could be called a grenade? A bomb? The circular explodey thing. Either way, it's a nice intro into what she can do, and it adds some fun choreography to the fight scene. Deadpool's slide into the fight was cool as well, and I love the callback to the dubstep joke. Narratively, this fight represents Cable's second shot at killing Russell, and it ends with the release of the Juggernaut, which was set up during Wade and Russell's previous interactions where Wade encouraged Russell to find the biggest guy and make him his friend. So the Juggernaut serves to pay off that part of the story, and also as a means of shifting Cable from an antagonist to a reluctant ally because Deadpool and Cable now have a foe that neither of them can handle on their own. This third action scene was the best in the film overall because there was more variety with the addition of Domino into the fight, and it used the confined space of the truck interior in some interesting ways that allowed each of the three characters to show off their fighting prowess. The final major action scene took place at the boarding school. To be honest, this was perhaps the weakest of the action scenes overall, but it did have some really strong moments peppered in. First off, we get our CG fight with Juggernaut and Colossus. The only point of praise here for me was the song. When the words of the song finally registered, I couldn't stop laughing. If somehow you missed it, go back and watch that bit and listen for the lyrics. They are gold. However, once Colossus shows up to fight him, it's, well, bland. It's a big CG thing fighting another CG thing that was no more interesting than any of the other CG mishmashes Marvel has produced over the last several years. It doesn't stand out as either good or bad, it just is. Honestly, it's forgettable. Much like the fight Colossus had with Angel Dust in the first film. Sadly, the one weakness of Colossus's character in the Deadpool films is that the CG fights are just boring. We also have Russell chasing the headmaster through the school, chucking fire around, which the fire and explosions are fine in and of themselves, but Julian Dennison is utterly unconvincing and distracting enough to make them look a bit silly. Then there's Domino fighting the, I guess those dudes are orderlies, maybe? It's supposed to be a school, I think, but they dress like orderlies in a psych ward, so let's call them orderlies. This is well done for the most part, but unremarkable. Finally, the best part of the scene is Deadpool and Cable taking on the other set of armed orderlies outside. The bit where Deadpool asks Cable for a gun, gets refused, and says he's just going to use a brick is a nice callback to the first film where Deadpool consistently showed up to fights without enough weapons or ammo for the fight he's about to get into, and is thus forced to improvise in a fun way that adds something to the scene. Also, the final shots of where they fire almost in unison and Deadpool drops this line.
Oh my god, did you feel that too? Only best buddies execute pedophiles together.
That is just fun. Overall, I'm going to give the action in this film an 8. The opening montage allowed Deadpool to get in a lot of interesting kills, but I feel like this film toned down the acrobatics from the first movie and it felt a bit more generic. The prison fight was a much better showcase for Cable, which is understandable on some level, but I left this film feeling less impressed with Deadpool's action moments specifically in this movie. He was good, but not as interesting or dynamic as in the first film. The highlights were Cable and Domino, with Cable bringing in dynamic weaponry between his adjustable gun, the disc bombs, and his energy shield, and Domino allowing the film to do interesting things with how luck would actually work in a chaotic fight sequence. Ultimately though, while the action in this film was good, there was no standout moments like the 12 bullet sequence in the first film. Thus, the action in this film gets an 8. Now we'll move on to part 4, the plot.
Holy shit, Pickles. That guy's on fire.
We'll start with Act 1, which runs from the opening up to Deadpool's arrest. The first piece of praise here goes to the film actually showing that Wade and Vanessa's relationship had progressed forward from the first film. I cannot stand when films take an entire movie's worth of development and throw it in the trash during the opening sequence of a sequel so they can reset everything they accomplished the first time just to do it all over again. Deadpool 2 does not make that mistake, and I truly appreciated that. It sounds odd to have to praise that, but such is the state of sequels in the film world, sadly. The opening murder montage sequence was also great because it not only establishes what Deadpool had been up to since the end of the last film, but it also allows Deadpool to throw out a fun series of jokes while going full ham on some bad guys to get the film started on a high note. The sequence with Vanessa and the conversation about making a baby then helped show the progression of the relationship, which I praised at the outset here, but it also sets up Wade's history with abandonment, his fears of being a father, and how he feels about family. The film also did a great job of balancing the drama and humor following Vanessa's death by launching into the opening credits, which the film once again utilized as another avenue for humor and as a means to immediately start attacking the filmmakers for killing Vanessa. Perhaps the best meta joke in the credits is the one about the director being one of the men who killed the dog in John Wick, because, well, he was. The final half of the first act, showing that Vanessa's death rightfully broke Deadpool emotionally, provided some great moments for both humor and drama, and the scene where he tells Colossus about the asshole that got away was a particularly nice moment that was well written and acted. Moving on to the first meeting with Russell, Deadpool had a few good one-liners here before he realizes why Russell is doing what he's doing, and Deadpool's reaction to realizing that Russell was abused is exactly what the character would have done. I appreciate that Deadpool shooting the orderly was just instantaneous and unceremonious, like, these guys are hurting you? Bang. That is who Deadpool is. But not just the shoot first, ask questions later aspect, but also the standing up for kids who can't defend themselves, which was part of the first film as well if we recall the one merc job we saw him complete in Deadpool 1. Overall, I give the first act a 9. The pacing was great, the balance of action and comedy was great, and the development of Wade and Vanessa's relationship up to her death was also well done. Moving on to Act 2. This is where Deadpool gets thrown into the icebox, up to being ripped in half by the Juggernaut. The portion of the film in the icebox was great overall, and it was only hindered by Russell playing a larger part in this section. The emotional moments from Deadpool talking about dying and his advice to Russell, the jokes with Black Tom, and then the introduction and first encounter with Cable were all really well done. We see a progression of Wade's desire to just give up and be with Vanessa, clashing with his unwillingness to stand by and let Russell get hurt. We also get an introduction to Cable that limits the audience's understanding of the character as an antagonistic threat, but one that pushes Deadpool to his limits. The fight between the two characters also has a nice balance of back and forth that showed that neither was capable of fully getting the better of the other. This fight also served not only as an introduction of Cable's character, but also as a means of shifting Deadpool's motivation in the film. At the closing of the fight, Deadpool visits Vanessa in the space between life and death, and she gives him the line about kids allowing people to be better than they used to be. Thus, Wade realizes that protecting Russell is his chance to get his heart in the right place. This leads to the creation of the X-Force, which was chock full of great gags and a slew of funny character introductions that ends in a hilarious montage of extravagant deaths. This was a great series of scenes, between the selection of the X-Force team to their deaths, and then finally the exchange between Domino and Deadpool about predicting the problems with the wind that led to it all. It was a wonderful transition that led to the next full-on action sequence. Speaking of that action sequence, we get the trailer fight next, and as I argued previously, I think this might have been the strongest overall action sequence in the film. They used the space in the trailer well. Domino, Deadpool, and Cable were all able to do some interesting things in the scene, and the introduction of the Juggernaut was fun to watch because it started off with a really dramatic halt in the action the moment the Juggernaut slammed his fist down, and then meshed that moment with some really silly slow-motion ridiculousness. Deadpool then fanboying over Juggernaut only to end up getting ripped in half was also a nice ramping up of the concept from the first film, where we transitioned to DP needing to regrow some part of himself moving into the third act. Finally, Domino's reaction to seeing the Juggernaut and then eventually carrying Deadpool off like a backpack was really funny as well. Overall, this act also gets a 9. Cable's introduction was great, the X-Force bit was hilarious, and the trailer action sequence was perhaps the best action sequence in the film. Finally, we have Act 3. Cable joins the team, through to the end of the resolution. The opening scene with Wade regrowing his legs, the back and forth about that, Cable foolishly starting the conversation with "I'm here to proposition you," and then the full explanation of his backstory was all really good. Overall, the scene had a nice balance of drama and comedy that set the stakes for the final confrontation of the film. It also showed that Cable wasn't just a murderous psycho, but someone that had a legitimate reason for doing what he was doing. A reason that had some connection to Wade's own experience in losing Vanessa. The final fight then I've already covered in the previous section. The one thing to add to this is that Wade's death was a bit of a mixed bag for me. I would argue that the vast majority of the scene was really well done save for two things. One, they drug the pretending to die thing out a joke or two too far, and, well, Russell was there trying to emote. That said, Cable's decision to save Wade I really liked, and hats off to Josh Brolin's emotive talents when he kisses the bear, because his facial expressions alone were able to convey the range of emotions going through his mind as he made a really difficult decision. The relationship between Cable and Deadpool when he realizes that Cable sacrificed being with his family to save him was also really funny, and the final closing bit where Dopinder gets to run over the headmaster was also fun, and I absolutely loved Deadpool's reaction to it. Overall, this act also gets a 9. The opening scene got the act started off with a nice balance of humor and drama. The action scene was good overall, and there were some great emotional payoffs in the climax as well, particularly between Wade and Vanessa when he finally crosses over. With that said, let's take a look at the final scores for the plot. So Act 1 got a 9, Act 2 got a 9, and Act 3 got a 9 for a final score of 9 overall. Now I'll move on to Part 5, where I'll talk briefly about the architects of the film, as well as how it performed both critically and financially.
Why is your hand so tiny again?
That's not my hand.
Part 5. The Architects and Financials. The writers of Deadpool 2 were the same team from the first film with the addition of Ryan Reynolds. So we have Rhett Reese and Paul Wernick again, along with Reynolds writing the script. I went into details about Reese and Wernick's writing credits in the review of the first film, so I won't go over it all again except to highlight perhaps the most relevant films they co-wrote that might have predicted their success with the Deadpool films was the pair of Zombieland movies. As I said in the previous review, I think this shows that they have a talent for writing scripts that blend action and comedy quite well. The production team also remained the same, with Simon Kinberg, Laura Schuler-Donner, and Ryan Reynolds returning as the primary producers of the film. The interesting thing to note here at the start of 2025 is that Simon Kinberg was recently signed on by Disney Star Wars to write and produce a new trilogy of movies. The problem I see here is that he seems to be a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to writing in particular. I mean, you might think, ooh, he wrote Mr. and Mrs. Smith. That was pretty good. But wait, the next thing was X-Men 3. Ah! But wait, hold on, wait. But he also wrote the first Guy Ritchie Sherlock Holmes and Days of Future Past. Those were great. But then he wrote Van Forstic. Yeah! And X-Men Apocalypse. Ah! And Dark Phoenix. Good God, get out of here. So, like I said, mixed bag as a writer. God be with you, Star Wars. Not that Simon really has a whole lot left to ruin, let's be honest. So far, the primary architects of the film are the same as the first film, which I think shows why the overall quality remained consistent. The one major change, however, was in the director. Tim Miller was replaced by David Leitch in this film, and this was a major upgrade. In addition to co-directing the first John Wick film, Leitch has also made some other really great action films, namely Atomic Blonde, Bullet Train, and The Fall Guy, which were all notable not only for their action set pieces and fight choreography, but also the interesting use of bright, almost neon colors on top of drab backgrounds. He was a great choice to bring in for a Deadpool film, and I really wish we could have had him return for Deadpool and Wolverine. I think the action scenes could have really used his eye. As an interesting side note, apparently he began his work in Hollywood as a stuntman and was actually Brad Pitt's stunt double 5 times, which might explain how they ended up working together on Bullet Train. The critical and audience response. I will acknowledge at the outset here that critic and audience ratings of films are not a reliable metric for measuring the objective quality of a film. Furthermore, box office performance is likewise not a reliable metric for determining the objective quality of a film. That said, there is still a significant relationship between critical and audience response and box office performance, and these two factors, namely financial performance and critical response, are the two most readily available measures for assessing the success of a film. Thus, I like to look at how a film was rated and how it performed financially to get a sense of how the film performed in a general sense. All that said, I will quickly run down how I compiled the following statistics. For critical responses, I took the critic scores from both Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic and averaged them. I chose to do this because while one uses an aggregate score and the other uses a curated weighted average, the result is that one tends to be overly generous and the other overly strict, and I believe the truth lies somewhere in the middle. So that is the reasoning behind my method. For audience reactions, I have taken the scores from Rotten Tomatoes, Metacritic, and IMDb and averaged them together. For Metacritic and IMDb, I had to transpose the scores into a percentage and put them onto a 100-point scale to match how Rotten Tomatoes format scores as well. Finally, a small note on how I interpret what the percentages of critic and audience responses mean, and I will use another Josh Brolin classic and one of my favorite movies of all time, The Goonies, as an example. The Goonies has a critic score of 77% and an audience score of 91% on Rotten Tomatoes. So what does that actually mean? The first thing to understand is that this is not an average score out of 10, as in the average score critics gave the film was 7.7 out of 10. No. What it means is that 77% of the critics reviewed the film positively. In other words, the scale is basically dichotomous. Was the review good or bad? If good, goes in the good category and counts positively toward the score. However, there is no way to distinguish between the number of reviews that give the film a 10 out of 10 and the reviews that give the film a 5.6 out of 10. Long story long, the best way I've found to interpret that percentage is like this. There is a 77% probability that the average moviegoer will find the movie above average. So in our Goonies example, there is a 77% chance that the average reviewer would give the film at least a 5.6 out of 10. Then, according to audiences, there is a 91% chance that the average audience member would give the film at least a 5.6 out of 10. So basically, it's just hinting at the probability of being more pleased with the film than not. All that said, let's look at the results for Deadpool 2. For critical response, Deadpool 2 averaged a score of 75%. That is consistent with the first film, which also averaged a critic score of 75% and higher than Deadpool and Wolverine, which averaged a 67%. Given the overall consistency in how this film was structured compared with the first film, that seems to make sense. Regarding audience response, this film averaged a 79%, which is lower than both the first Deadpool film, which averaged an audience score of 83%, and Deadpool and Wolverine, which averaged an audience score of 84%. I will note here though that the audience score for the Deadpool and Wolverine film on Rotten Tomatoes compared to the other two sites was a statistical outlier, which means it was significantly different from the other two and raised the score quite a bit. Take from that what you will. All that said, it seems that the audiences were equally pleased with the first and third films a bit more, and reception from the audiences for the second film was a bit lower. This I found a bit surprising, but I guess that's just my blinding hatred for Deadpool and Wolverine showing through. Finally, let's take a look at how this film performed financially. The metric I like to use to measure a film's overall financial success is to analyze the profit margin of the film. And I do this because profit margin indicates how much profit the company makes for every dollar of revenue generated. For example, if a company reports that it achieved a 35% profit margin, it means that it netted 35 cents for each dollar of sales generated. Therefore, the profit margin looks at what the box office of the film was in comparison to what it cost to get a realistic idea of how much money the production company might have actually walked away with. To get a somewhat accurate calculation for this, we need two important pieces of information: the total expenses of the film and the total box office. Now, the total expenses are tricky for a few reasons. First, we have to trust that what the production company reports is accurate, and second, the reported budgets never include factors like promotional costs and the revenue deducted from the movie theaters for tickets. Thus, one reliable metric for estimating total expenses is to take the reported budget and multiply it by 2.5. For expenses, I took the numbers from Wikipedia, and for total box office, I relied on numbers from Box Office Mojo. Once we have these two numbers, the calculation for profit margin looks like this. Total expenses equals the reported budget times 2.5. Profit equals total box office minus total expenses. And then the profit margin equals 100 times the profit divided by the total box office. All that wonky math business now done, the reported budget of Deadpool 2 was $110 million, and the total box office revenue was $785.8 million for a total profit margin of 65%, which means that the studio netted 65 cents for each dollar of the total box office revenue. As a comparison, the first Deadpool film had a profit margin of 81%, and Deadpool and Wolverine had a profit margin of 62%. Thus, this film was a step down in terms of profitability compared to the first film, largely due to the inflated budget. But it was actually slightly more profitable compared to Deadpool and Wolverine, even though the latter accrued a much larger overall box office total. So that's a bit about the people who made the film and how it performed critically and financially. Now let's move on to the final section, Part 6, Closing Thoughts.
So stay here in Chateau de Virgin while we go get our fuck on.
Deadpool 2 was a good sequel to the first movie that did a lot of things well. Starting with the characters, the progression of Deadpool into a character that wanted to be a part of a team was well executed and carried on from concepts brought over from the first film, namely his adamant refusal to join the X-Men. The film put him on a believable path that moved him off of that stance, and his little family at the end felt earned, rather than forced. Furthermore, the progression also prepared him for the next stage in he and Vanessa's relationship, which was starting a family of their own. Cable also had a nice progression from antagonist to reluctant ally to willing teammate, and his banter with Deadpool provided some of the best comedic moments in the film. Then there was Domino, who was effective comedically and in the few action scenes she was part of, and the film did a good job of making her power interesting through both visuals and dialogue. Additionally, the character growth of Dopender and Colossus in the first film was respected and expanded in this film. The one weakness in terms of characters is that some supporting characters were reduced in their roles to make room for Russell, and while Russell's motivations and backstory served the overall narrative well, his characterization could best be described as obnoxious. The film also mostly succeeded comedically because it maintained the approach of giving each of the supporting cast a unique voice that allowed their interactions with Deadpool to produce slightly different comedic outcomes. In other words, not every joke sounded like variations of Deadpool talking, but rather it was the interplay of Deadpool's character bouncing his absurd personality off of different sources and how those reactions could create different kinds of jokes. However, as good as some of the jokes were, being a sequel, the tendency to replay gags was not as fresh and did not hit as hard as the first film, and they tried to let Russell tell jokes and none of them landed. The action in Deadpool 2 was also strong because the action scenes were again narratively relevant, not just an excuse to have an action scene. And both Cable and Domino provided the film with unique skill sets and weaponry that allowed for new approaches in the fight dynamics. Moreover, the film brought in a director that has a long history with stunt work and fight coordination, and someone who has proven his prowess as an action film director. Finally, the sequel was good because the plot and the character motivations were coherent and consistent from start to finish. Deadpool wanted to protect Russell, and the reasoning behind that ran through almost every conversation he had with Vanessa from the start of the film about children, fatherhood, and making a family, and then he makes a family by the end of the film. Then there was also the beautiful symmetry of Deadpool being the lost cause that Colossus refused to give up on, and then Russell becoming the lost cause Deadpool refused to give up on, and Deadpool having to go to Colossus for help with that. The film also made a kind of mirror out of Russell and Cable's motivations, where both were motivated by revenge, but neither of them were truly evil at heart, and they just needed a chance to choose a different path, which Deadpool gives them in his moment of sacrifice. When Deadpool takes that bullet, Russell realizes that he has someone that cares about him and that he can trust, and Cable realizes that there was a way to save his family without needing to kill Russell. Russell then steps off the path that led him to killing Cable's family, and Cable chooses to sacrifice returning to his family to save Deadpool. Most of all, this film was good because all of these emotional moments were earned through the character progression shown in the film. To wrap up, while this film was not quite as good as the first, held back mainly by Russell's characterization and the fact that the humor and action was not quite as novel, it was a good film overall. There were even some aspects that were a direct upgrade because Cable was a much better antagonist than Francis because Cable actually had some character progression and was far more dynamic as a character. It would have been really nice to see the third film in this series take a similar approach as this one did and try to work on building the characters they had and continuing Deadpool's journey toward learning how to be a more balanced human. I mean, I would have loved to see what could have come from him becoming a father and then having a storyline where Cable and Colossus have to try and teach him how to not be a shit dad and seeing how their different advice bounces off of Wade. But c'est la vie. That said, let's take a look at the final scores for this film. So in the end, the characters got an 8, the humor got an 8, the action got an 8, and the plot got a 9, for a total score of 8.3. That brings me to the end of my review of Deadpool 2. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please smash that like button, and if you are so inclined, drop me a comment to let me know what you think. I am still new to YouTube as well, so any suggestions are much appreciated. So until next time, always remember.
I don't bargain, pumpkin fucker.